This MacBook seemed like the next big thing, but once it got into the hands of reviewers and buyers, it had them wondering why it even existed in the first place. The thing is, it wasn't Apple's goal to sell these particular Macs. It was actually because Apple had a much more interesting strategy up their sleeve. But what was their strategy, and more importantly, why was this MacBook such a necessary part of it? Well, it all began back in 2020. Apple had just announced the release of the M1 chips, and with this announcement came two new Macs running on the new chips: the MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air. Now, a lot of people at the time were upset that these new Macs didn't have a redesign, or at the very least a new color to make them feel a little bit different, but the main point of these was just to show how powerful these new chips were by sticking them in designs that people were already familiar with. The only real difference between the M1 models and the old Intel models, aside from the new chips, was that the MacBook Air had the fans taken out of it. The MacBook Pro, meanwhile, still had the fans. And this is where our discussion begins. You see, a lot of reviewers at the time were praising the MacBook Air because it was able to do so well performance-wise without having those fans inside of it. This was especially true when it was put up against the M1 MacBook Pro, since the Pro just performed marginally better over longer periods of time thanks to those fans. And the thing is, this is why a lot of people were recommending the Air over the Pro. There was really no need to spend that extra money on what was basically the same laptop. And this is why the MacBook Pro existed: to get people excited about M1. I mean, Apple could stand on stage all day and talk about all the benefits of M1, but they also needed to show people just how good it was to get them on board with their vision. Technically, they could have just released the MacBook Air by itself, but they needed something that people could compare it to just to highlight how good the MacBook Air and the M1 chip as a whole actually was. I mean, the MacBook Air was basically the kind of computer that a lot of people were used to. It's a little bit thicker, and it needed fans for cooling. But by releasing this alongside the M1 MacBook Air, which was thinner and had no fans whatsoever, Apple could show people that you really didn't need that thicker design or the fans with these new chips. It was actually a pretty genius marketing strategy, and it's actually one that worked really well. According to the IDC, Apple shipped 6.7 million Macs in the first quarter of 2021, which is more than double the sales during the first quarter of 2020, which is when the last of the Intel MacBooks were released. Keep in mind, Apple had released the M1 versions of both the Air and the Pro the same year they came out with new Intel versions, and yet they still managed to sell nearly 7 million M1 MacBooks in the middle of a chip shortage. And while we don't have exact numbers for how much of which model was sold, the Airs have way more reviews than the Pros do, so we can kind of assume that the Airs sold a lot more than the Pros. And because this strategy was apparently so successful for them, they decided to stick with a similar strategy for the M2 chips. But M2 was a bit different. By this point, people were starting to become aware of just how good the M1 chips were, and Apple's vision for the future was also starting to get clearer now that they were beginning to expand their Mac lineup and even start to expand their chip lineup. But now it was time for M2, and with the release of the M2 chip came the completely redesigned MacBook Air. But Apple made a pretty interesting decision. Rather than update the base M2 MacBook Pro as well, they instead kept everything exactly the same. It was literally the same computer from 2 years ago, just with a chip upgrade. MacBook Air, meanwhile, upgraded everything from the display to the webcam and everything in between, all while keeping the price less than that of the MacBook Pro. But if this was Apple's decision, then why would they keep the Pro like this if it was obviously the inferior option? Well, seemingly, it was to give the illusion of value for the MacBook Air. Both the Air and the Pro with comparable specs cost the same $1,300 price tag, but which would you rather buy? The one with a design and spec sheet straight out of the mid-2010s, or the thinner, sleeker one that feels like it was made this year? Chances are you'd go for the second option. And this went even further when the 15-inch MacBook Air was released, because not only were you getting all the benefits of the M2 MacBook Air, but you even got a bigger display, and when this came out, even the 13-inch MacBook Air got a price increase, which made it an even better value than the Pro. At this point, there was no real reason to get the Pro over the Air, and when the M3 chips came out, there was really nothing more that Apple could do with the strategy. That massive increase in sales the M1 Air had over the M1 Pro didn't exactly carry over to the M2 models, so the strategy didn't seem to be as effective this time around. They had already proved what the M1 and M2 chips were capable of, and with the M3 chips came a redesigned base model MacBook Pro. If you want to hear more about this new MacBook Pro along with the M3 iMacs, be sure to check out this video right here, and I'll see you guys over there. Adios.